I became interested in this question because in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul appeals specifically to a principle that was identified with the origins of democracy. At Athens, democracy was built upon two principles: eleutheria, freedom, and isotes, the equality of citizens. Paul uses the word. He's the only early Christian to do this. He appeals to the principle of equality in the collection that he is raising for the poor in Jerusalem. And of course, Paul also makes a great deal out of eleutheria, freedom. And so I began wondering, how could these ideals that were democratic in origin, why are they reviving in Paul's letters? For a long period between the collapse of the democratic experiment at Athens and the first century, there is very little discourse about equality and freedom. The Greek word isotes appears very rarely on public inscriptions, and then only as a virtue of someone who is being honored alongside other virtues. So it was actually my work on equality that led me then to ask, how democratic, and I put the word in quotation marks because for me it was really a question. Were the Christ groups established by Paul accurately described as democratic in character? Or is it better to describe Paul as sympathetic to the common people who are not educated, who are mostly poor, and who are not of noble birth? Paul says at the beginning of 1 Corinthians that the majority of the believers in Corinth are to be categorized in that way. And yet Paul assures them, all things are yours, using a formula that is very close to the basis of democracy in the constitutional debate that is found in Herodotus. So I began asking myself, how democratic really was the Pauline ecclesia? And I tried to evaluate the evidence. Well, it's clear that most of the believers in Corinth were not from the elite. They were not well educated. They were not nobly born. But Paul intervenes on their behalf. We don't have their names. The named individuals in 1 Corinthians, Chloe, Crispus, Gaius, Stephanas. Eventually in Romans 16, there is a man named Erastus who is described as the oikonomos tes poleos, the financial manager of the city. If you do a prosopography of these individuals, they constitute the few who had all of the social advantages, education, wealth, perhaps birth. Now, they are not in the very highest economic level. At Corinth, we don't find any knights, we don't find any senators, but they have more than minimal resources. They have a surplus. They are householders. And it is only the names of these people that Paul mentions, mainly because they are the troublemakers in the community. The poor on behalf of whom Paul intervenes in the debate over the allocation of food at the Lord's Supper, the communal meal, they remain anonymous. And the women who are praying and prophesying in the assembly in the first part of 1 Corinthians 11, they are also anonymous. And the persons who were enslaved when they were called in 1 Corinthians 7, they are also anonymous. But if you look at the field of onomastics, which is very highly developed in the Scandinavian countries, and names reveal a lot of things. The names of some individuals that are mentioned by Paul betray a background of people that were either slaves or freed slaves. So the two traveling companions of Stephanus, Fortunatus and Achaicus, both of those are recurring slave names. Tertius, the scribe of the Epistle to the Romans, who speaks up in his own voice. He doesn't wait for Paul to mention him. He speaks in the next to the last paragraph of Romans. So we do occasionally hear the voices of the non-elite in Paul's letters, but for the most part, they remain anonymous. A very good question. And in my own attempts to speculate, right, we're talking about motivations that have to be inferred. And I think we have to put this in the context of the middle of the first century. So it is clear that some of the Christ followers in Corinth were people who were attracted to Judaism, to the synagogue. If the account that the author of Acts gives in chapter 18 of the origins of the Christ movement in Corinth, if that is to be trusted, then among the first converts is the former archisynagogos, the president of the synagogue, Crispus. In 1 Corinthians 1:14, he is named in the same breath with Gaius. And Paul reveals that he baptized both of these people with his own hands. So I began asking myself, why would an archisynagogos, who is a person who, from the study that has been done of synagogue presidents by a number of really wonderful scholars, David Noy and others, why would people with resources, Gaius, who Paul says in Romans 16:23 is the host of the whole ecclesia. He has a large enough house to host all the Christ believers of Corinth. Stephen Friesen, my colleague at the University of Texas, who attempted to do a demography of the Pauline mission, asserts that Gaius of Corinth is the wealthiest early Christian that we know about, because he has a house large enough to host the whole ecclesia. Of course, how large the house was, whether it was a villa, depends upon estimates about the size of the Christ group in Corinth. But why would a person like that join a movement which, according to Paul says, remember your calling, your klesis, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were educated, not many of you were wealthy, not many of you were nobly born. So the majority of Christ followers, the people who found Paul's message appealing, were uneducated, poor, and low-born. So what about the few who had resources? What would have attracted them? And in an effort to find an answer, I engaged in a thought experiment. If you follow the early chronology of Paul's life, which I do, which was put forward by John Knox and subscribed to later by David Horrell and Gerd Ludemann and Larry Welborn, I think Paul began his work in Macedonia and Achaia in the early 40s. And if he wrote 1 Thessalonians in the year 40 or 41, this was in the immediate aftermath of the Caligula crisis. The Caligula crisis was a shock, a terrible shock for Jews and Jewish sympathizers, for anyone who found the moral world of Judaism attractive, who found monotheism attractive. Caligula's attempt to have himself worshipped as a god, his plan to have a golden statue of himself erected in the temple at Jerusalem. We know from Philo's two political writings, the delegation to Gaius and the writing against Flaccus, the governor of Egypt, that when the little gold statues of Caligula arrived in Alexandria, the Greeks, who were in competition with the Jews for education and for economic well-being, they saw their opportunity. They broke into the Jewish synagogues and replaced the Torah with the gold statues of Caligula. And the barricades went up in the streets of Alexandria. Alexandria was not it's only the best documented because of Philo. It was not the only place with a substantial Jewish population that experienced the trauma of the Caligula crisis. Philo names 4, I think, places in the Mediterranean where the Jewish population was large enough to qualify as a Jewish colony. Corinth is one of those. So in my own attempt to engage in a thought experiment, why would certain, not everyone, but certain people who were not poor and lowborn, why would they be attracted? People like Gaius, for example. And I think it is because as Jewish sympathizers, perhaps even God-fearers, the author of the book of Acts says that Paul attracted God-fearers in Corinth. So I think for these people, the Caligula crisis was a terrible shock and a trauma. And I think they found in the communities established by the Apostle Paul a kind of psychological, social, political refuge, a barrier against the shock that they had experienced. So I guess without adopting the entire armature of trauma theory, and if you look at the writings of Philo, there is a deep sadness and pessimism that creeps into the later writings, that expresses itself in the delegation to Gaius and the writing against Flaccus. It's clear that the Caligula crisis revealed that Judaism was not going to enjoy a happy future in the Roman Empire. So by the time Paul writes Romans, probably in the spring of 58 AD, the outbreak of the Great War that results in the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple is what? 8 years away. Only 8 years. So we're talking, just as my grandparents told me that they could sense the catastrophe that was coming in the 1930s when Hitler was coming to power, just as we today, sadly, as we are witnessing the rise of authoritarianism all over the world, the revival of war in Europe, the ambitions of Putin and Russia, I think anyone with political sensibility knows that the coming years are going to be difficult. And I think that we can posit something like that in the middle of the first century. I've referred to it as the midnight of the early empire, the period from Caligula to Nero. And these are Paul's emperors, right? His entire project plays itself out in that terrible period between the Caligula crisis and the absolute catastrophe of Nero that results in the year of the 4 emperors, a terribly destructive civil war, the beginning of the war with Jerusalem. So I think the people who were initially attracted to the Pauline communities were Jewish sympathizers like Gaius, probably Stephanus, who found in the Pauline communities a way of pursuing their hopes for a different future in the face of the gathering crisis. Now that's speculative, right? Yeah. But I think that's... It's not implausible. It's not implausible. No. And the person who told you when you asked this question, that's the million or billion dollar question. One of my mentors in this field was the great Edwin Judge at Macquarie University in Australia, and I had an appointment at Macquarie for a number of years. When Edwin Judge left New Zealand and went to Oxford and Cambridge, his Dr. Vater there, his mentor, was the great A.H.M. Jones. And he proposed as his dissertation topic precisely an answer to this question. And the result was the remarkable book, The Social Pattern of the Early Christian Groups. He was looking for an answer to that question in the year 1960. And there's a good reason why that book won the Tyndall Prize and why it was the beginning of serious work on the sociological context of early Christianity, and it's the legacy in which our president here this year in the Colloquium Biblicum, John Kloppenborg, is the heir, right, of the attempt to answer this question that was the initial doctoral project of Edwin Judge. When I arrived at Macquarie in 2009, he was still frighteningly alive. Such an amazing intelligence. And the first paper that I gave at Macquarie, on the basis of which I was offered an academic appointment, Edwin Judge was my respondent. I was more nervous than I've ever been in my life. But it turned out he was a real gentleman and became a close friend and mentor over the years. I'll tell you the three thinkers, intellectuals who formed my understanding of this and why and how I pursue it. First, as you can tell from my accent, I'm a Southerner. I'm from the Deep South, from the hills of Mississippi. And our local poet laureate was the great William Faulkner, novelist, winner of the Nobel Prize. In his novel, there is a conversation. This is Absalom, a conversation between Jason and Quentin Compton. And the son asks the father, what about the past? Why should we care about it? And the father answers, son, the past is not dead. It isn't even past. And I believe that. My teacher at the University of Chicago, Arnaldo Momigliano, understood that the historian was a combatant. He's not simply a disinterested observer on the sidelines of history. The historian has a role in the way that we understand ourselves in the present and the future that we imagine for ourselves. And Momigliano understood that he was not a disinterested observer, and I'm not. And then finally, when I came to Germany as a young student and began my studies there, the works of the great German Jewish philosopher, literary critic, Walter Benjamin, were being published for the first time. It wasn't a Benjamin Renaissance. They were coming finally into print. And as you probably know, one of Benjamin's most important works, it was his last book, Theses on the Philosophy of History. Are you familiar with this work? It's the closest thing I know to an inspired text in the modern period. And in that book, Benjamin asserts that it is the task of the historian to grasp the constellation which our moment of history has formed with a definite previous one, and to give that constellation a shock. Benjamin said, that is what it means to be a historical materialist. Benjamin understood history writing to be a process of liberation and redemption. he asserted that we nourish ourselves not on the fantasy of some successful progeny in the future, but we nourish ourselves on the memory of enslaved ancestors, of people whose lives might have been different. And so to go back to the past and to retrieve those things that are not dead, that are for which we are still fighting, that are working themselves out in the controversies of our present moment. That is my understanding of what it means to be a historian. So, of course, the historian has to use the available evidence and to read the documents, the text and the inscriptions, the coins, the papyri, to read everything with as great a detail and attention and even, I would try to say, objectivity as possible. But I think historians fail their calling and they deceive themselves if they claim that they are not reading the past and using history for purposes in the present and in the future. Even Nietzsche wrote this remarkable text on the use and abuse of history for life, an amazing work. And yeah, that's the way I approach history. Of course, I don't bring an ideology to my reading of the text. I don't have an animus against Paul like so many of my American colleagues now who, because Christianity has allied itself in the United States with the political right wing, with fundamentalism, and so, they have an animus against Paul. I don't approach Paul that way. I see him, I hope, for what he is, a genius, an extremely gifted person who also had shortcomings and didn't always live up to his own best ideals, who was willing to compromise for the sake of achieving a purpose. For me, it has been an inspiring corrective to the growing indifference toward early Christian writers, perhaps here in Europe, and the animus of American academics. What has been a source of hope and inspiration for me is a group of secular philosophers, atheists, Marxists, who have discovered Paul. So, for example, Alain Badiou, some people would say the most interesting philosopher of the modern period, in his little book, St. Paul, the Foundation of Universalism. You know what he says. He says the Pauline message, the Pauline understanding of a subject who is not conditioned by race or gender or class, Badiou describes that as the primal truth event in the history of the West. That's an atheist and a Marxist who says this. And I've written several things in dialogue with Badiou, articles, but also a little book called Paul's Summons to Messianic Life, Political Theology and the Coming Awakening. Another one, of course, is Giorgio Agamben, who, in his book, a little commentary on Paul's, the first 7 words of Paul's letter to the Romans, The Time That Remains. Agamben has been a dialogue partner for me for several years now, and my little book, Paul's Summons, is a lover's quarrel with Agamben, not only about the legacy of Paul, but also the legacy of Walter Benjamin. And Agamben and Badiou are only two. We could name many others. Zizek.
Taubes even?
Taubes, of course. Yeah. I go back to Taubes. I wrote, a whole chapter on Taubes for this book, Paul in the Grip, of the continental philosophers. So for me, those people are now an inspiration, and it makes me realize that Paulinism, the Pauline project, is not dead. Right now, as Walter Benjamin said at the beginning of the theses on the philosophy of history, where he compared our current situation as historians and political theologians, he said, it's like this. Historical materialism is like a puppet that sits in front of a chess table, and he is able to win every game against any opponent. But what people don't realize is that underneath the table sits a hunchback dwarf, and he controls the hands of the puppet with strings. And then Benjamin says, in this analogy, the puppet is historical materialism, the hunchback dwarf is theology. And Agamben has argued, in particular, by tracing notations in Benjamin's typescripts and manuscripts, that really the hunchback dwarf is Paul. Benjamin revives Paul's concept of the nun kairos, the now time. In Benjamin it reemerges as the Jetztzeit, the messianic time, in which revolutionary action, the only future that is really worth living or thinking about, beyond these terrible autocracies that threaten now to crush the human spirit, the inequality that threatens to crush the human spirit. So, yeah, I draw inspiration from these people, but I should be honest with you all, I have not at all given up on the church. I write academic books that are historical and philological, but every Sunday of the year, except for Christmas and Easter, I'm teaching in some church, attempting to bring the fruits of scholarship into dialogue with people who are still feeling the klesis. They're still called into a Christian community. And I was encouraged to do this by the great Dieter Georgi, who was a mentor of mine, who adopted me into his circle. And, for many years he hosted a conference every couple of years outside Frankfurt on the theme of teaching the Bible as a force for social change. And his agenda is still mine.
So you're a Bultmann grandson?
Yeah. I teach at a Catholic university, a Jesuit university. I'm the only Protestant on the faculty of theology at this university. Everyone else is a Catholic or a Muslim or Jewish. And so when I went there and accepted the position, I was given by young Paul Seebeck at Moore Seebeck a beautiful, larger-than-life poster, a photograph of Bultmann taken in 1976, just before his death. And I wasn't sure whether my Catholic colleagues would want to see a picture of Rudy on the wall of a Jesuit university, but after they gave me tenure and a full professorship, I installed Rudolf Bultmann on the wall of my office.